Somewhere along the edge of West Antarctica, a floating slab of ice roughly the size of a small country is doing something scientists have been dreading for years. It's falling apart. Satellite imagery, captured this year, shows massive gashes tearing across the surface of the Thwaites Eastern Ice Shelf. Deep fissures that simply did not exist just a few years ago. And the researchers who have spent nearly a decade studying this specific stretch of ice are now saying, in plain, direct language, that this shelf is not just weakening, it's disintegrating in real time, and it may fully break apart before the end of this year. That might sound like a fairly localized event, a single chunk of remote Antarctic ice breaking off in a place almost nobody will ever visit. It is not. This particular shelf functions as the last remaining natural break holding back one of the most consequential glaciers on the entire planet, a glacier so significant to the future of global sea levels that it earned the nickname the Doomsday Glacier years before this current crisis even began. Today, we're going to walk through exactly what scientists just discovered, why this specific piece of floating ice matters so disproportionately to coastlines thousands of miles away, what the new research reveals about how this glacier's retreat actually began, and why researchers studying it are being unusually direct about the fact that this collapse, however it eventually unfolds, is not something anyone is going to be able to stop. Before we get into it, if the idea of a single glacier at the bottom of the world having this much influence over coastlines everywhere else genuinely surprises you, drop a comment and let us know your first reaction, and whether you live somewhere that could eventually feel the effects of rising seas firsthand. And if you want to keep following the science on this as it develops, because this is very much an ongoing, actively unfolding story rather than a settled one, go ahead and subscribe now, since researchers are watching this glacier essentially every single day right now. Let's start with the basics of what Thwaites Glacier actually is, because understanding its scale is essential to understanding why scientists take it this seriously. Thwaites sits along the coast of West Antarctica, and it is genuinely enormous, roughly the same size as the state of Florida, making it one of the widest glaciers on the entire planet. It already contributes something in the neighborhood of 4% of all global sea level rise on its own, shedding billions of tons of ice into the Southern Ocean every single year. If Thwaites melted away entirely on its own, in isolation, scientists estimate it would raise global sea levels by roughly 65 centimeters, a bit more than 2 feet. That number alone would be significant, but it is not actually the number that earned this glacier its ominous nickname. Thwaites functions as something closer to a structural cork, holding back a vastly larger body of ice sitting behind it, the West Antarctic Ice Sheet, and if Thwaites destabilizes badly enough to let that much larger ice sheet begin flowing more freely into the ocean behind it, the total potential contribution to global sea level rise climbs dramatically, with some estimates placing the total possible rise at up to 10 feet, if the broader collapse it could trigger were to play out in full. 10 feet of global sea level rise is not a regional inconvenience. It is the kind of number that redraws coastlines, threatens the long-term viability of major coastal cities including Miami and London, and poses an existential threat to low-lying nations and island communities across the Pacific and in places like Bangladesh, where tens of millions of people already live at elevations that leave almost no margin for error. To understand exactly what just happened, and why it represents such a specific, meaningful escalation rather than simply more of the same ongoing concern researchers have voiced for years, you need to understand the role that floating ice shelves play in a glacier system like this one. Glaciers themselves are not floating. They are grounded on bedrock, slowly flowing downhill under their own weight toward the ocean. But at the point where a glacier like Thwaites meets the sea, a portion of that ice extends out over the water, floating on the ocean's surface while still remaining physically attached to the grounded ice behind it. That floating extension is called an ice shelf, and it plays a critical mechanical role that has nothing to do with how much ice it directly contains and everything to do with the physical resistance it provides. An intact ice shelf acts like a dam, or perhaps more precisely, like a cork wedged into the neck of a bottle, physically bracing against the grounded ice behind it, and slowing down how quickly that inland ice can flow toward the ocean and eventually break off as icebergs, a process scientists call calving. Remove that cork, and the ice behind it is free to accelerate its flow toward the sea dramatically, sometimes within a matter of just a few years, rather than the many decades or centuries such a transition might otherwise take. For years, Thwaites Glacier has actually had 2 separate ice shelves helping to brace it in this way, a western shelf and an eastern shelf. The western shelf has already been in an advanced, well-documented state of collapse for some time, its structural integrity so far gone that scientists studying it have largely written off its ability to meaningfully hold back the glacier's flow. That left the eastern ice shelf as the last significant natural break still functioning, the final structural element still providing real, measurable resistance against the glacier's acceleration into the sea. And that is precisely the piece of ice that new satellite imagery this year has shown tearing apart at a pace that has genuinely startled the researchers who have been watching it closely. Karen Alley, a glaciologist at the University of Manitoba who has spent years analyzing exactly how this specific breakup has been unfolding, described the change in blunt terms, saying that when she compares recent satellite images to what she personally observed on site back in 2019 and 2020, she genuinely does not recognize the shelf anymore. Huge gashes have appeared where there used to be none, cutting across sections of ice that had remained comparatively stable for years before this recent acceleration began. It's worth pausing here to understand just how significant it is that this specific eastern shelf held on as long as it did, because that context helps explain why its current disintegration carries so much weight among researchers who have been tracking this glacier system for years. The Western Shelf's earlier collapse was, in a sense, the outcome scientists had already grown accustomed to watching unfold, a slower-moving, long-anticipated deterioration that had been documented across the better part of a decade. The Eastern Shelf, by contrast, had shown comparatively good structural stability for much of that same period, holding its shape and its bracing function, even as conditions elsewhere along the glacier's front continued to deteriorate. That relative stability is part of why researchers had specifically flagged the Eastern Shelf as the glacier's remaining safety margin, the one structural feature still meaningfully buying time before the grounded ice behind it would be free to accelerate. Watching that specific piece of ice begin failing this rapidly, after years of relative resilience, is precisely what has shifted the tone of the scientific commentary surrounding Thwaites from long-term concern toward the kind of urgent, present-tense language researchers are now using. Robert Larder, a marine geophysicist with the British Antarctic Survey, who coordinates the United Kingdom's side of the international Thwaites Glacier collaboration, the joint American and British research partnership that has been directly studying this glacier since 2018, has been similarly direct about what the data is now showing. Larder has stated plainly that the last remaining bit of ice shelf sitting in front of the glacier is poised to disintegrate, adding that while scientists don't yet know exactly how this particular ice shelf is going to break up, whether it fractures into a handful of large icebergs or shatters more gradually into a chaotic field of smaller pieces, there is no meaningful scientific doubt remaining about whether it's going to happen at all. It's definitely going to go, in his own words, and current projections suggest that breakup could begin as early as this year. Christian Wild, a geophysicist at the University of Innsbruck, who has also been tracking the same satellite data, described the pace of the disintegration in similarly stark terms, noting that large areas of the shelf are now simply falling apart, seemingly all at once, after holding relatively steady for years. The specific mechanism behind this collapse has been documented in remarkable, close-range detail by a study published in the Journal of Geophysical Research, which examined 2 full decades of fracture data collected across what researchers call the shear zone, the specific band of ice where the floating shelf experiences the most intense structural stress as it grinds against slower-moving ice nearby and against the pinning points that have historically helped anchor it in place. That research identified a clear 2-phase pattern in how this kind of structural failure tends to unfold. First, long shear fractures gradually expand across the ice over an extended period, cracks stretching further and further as the underlying stress on the shelf accumulates. Then, once those long fractures reach a certain critical extent, researchers observed a sudden spike in the number of smaller fractures appearing throughout the surrounding ice, essentially the ice shelf's structural integrity giving way in a cascading, self-reinforcing pattern once the initial long cracks have done enough damage to destabilize the surrounding material. The 2-phase signature is exactly the pattern researchers say they are now watching play out on the eastern ice shelf in real time, which is precisely why scientists studying this glacier have moved from describing it as vulnerable or at risk toward describing it far more urgently as actively disintegrating. What's driving all of this from underneath the ice is arguably even more significant than what's visible from above on satellite imagery, because it explains not just that the shelf is breaking apart, but why that breakup has accelerated so sharply in such a relatively short window of time. Research combining satellite observations with direct GPS measurements collected on the ice itself found that seawater is now moving more than 6 miles beneath the glacier, funneling warm ocean water directly into the space between the ice and the bedrock underneath it, a process that dramatically intensifies melting from below in a location largely hidden from any direct visual observation. Rob Larder, describing this specific finding, said the data indicates the glacier is set to retreat further and faster than previously understood, specifically because of this deep, hidden channel of warm water actively working to erode the ice from beneath, rather than the more commonly discussed process of surface melting or direct ocean contact along the shelf's exposed edges. A separate research team, using an underwater robot called Icefin, specifically designed to navigate beneath Antarctic ice and gather direct measurements in places no ship or human diver could safely reach, has been documenting exactly how this warm water actually behaves once it reaches the base of the ice shelf. Their observations revealed that warm, dense ocean water doesn't simply sit passively beneath the ice. gradually melting it from below in a smooth, predictable way. Instead, that water forms swirling eddies, some of them measuring up to 6 miles across, that spin and actively burrow underneath the glacier, funneling warm water through deep cracks in existing ice formations in a way that dramatically accelerates localized melting wherever those eddies happen to be active. And researchers have identified a troubling feedback loop embedded directly within this process. As the ice melts, it releases cold, relatively fresh meltwater into the surrounding ocean. And when that cold meltwater mixes with the warmer, saltier ocean water pushing in from further out, it generates additional ocean turbulence. And that turbulence itself works to melt even more ice, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that intensifies the more it operates. Leah Siegelman, an assistant professor at UC San Diego who co-authored research documenting this specific feedback mechanism, told reporters that this particular loop could gain even more intensity as the broader climate continues warming, meaning the mechanism actively accelerating Thwaites' collapse right now is one that current climate trends are likely to make measurably worse, rather than one that might simply level off or stabilize on its own. What makes this underwater robotic observation genuinely groundbreaking, rather than simply a more detailed confirmation of what researchers already suspected, is the timescale it operates on. Most of what scientists previously understood about ice shelf melting came from satellite measurements and periodic surface observations, data that could reveal how much a given shelf had thinned or retreated over a span of months or years, but that offered very little insight into the actual moment-to-moment physical processes driving that change deep beneath the ice. The Icefin missions changed that fundamentally, allowing researchers to track these warm water eddies swirling and burrowing beneath the glacier, not across years, but across individual hours and days, effectively watching the melting process unfold in something close to real time for the first time in the history of Antarctic glaciology. That shift from a slow, retrospective understanding of ice shelf melt toward a much faster, more immediate picture of the actual physical mechanism at work is part of why researchers have grown so much more confident and so much more urgent in how they're now describing what's happening to Thwaites, since they're no longer inferring the underlying process indirectly from surface change alone, but watching significant components of it play out directly, robot camera in hand, beneath the ice itself. One of the more genuinely surprising findings to come out of the broader ongoing research effort into Thwaites concerns not what's happening to the glacier right now, but when its current retreat actually began. Using an extensive combination of satellite data, GPS measurements, and detailed geological records pulled from the sediment beneath the glacier, researchers determined that Thwaites' modern retreat first began sometime in the 1940s, likely triggered by a particularly powerful El Niño event during that decade. That finding matters enormously because it demonstrates something important about how a glacier system of this scale actually behaves once a retreat gets underway. Thwaites did not begin its current multi-decade retreat because of a slow, gradual warming trend building steadily since that point. It began because a specific, comparatively brief climate event, a strong El Niño lasting perhaps a year or two, was apparently enough to nudge the glacier's underlying dynamics past some critical threshold, and once that threshold was crossed, the retreat that followed simply never reversed, even during the many intervening decades when conditions were not being actively pushed in that same direction. That's precisely the kind of behavior that concerns glaciologists most about systems like this one. Glaciers of this size don't necessarily respond to change in a smooth, proportional way, where removing the original trigger allows the system to gradually return to its previous state. Once a large enough section of grounded ice loses its footing and begins retreating, the retreat can become effectively self-sustaining, driven by its own internal dynamics, rather than requiring continuous, escalating external pressure to keep going. The 2025 report published by the International Thwaites Glacier Collaboration reinforced exactly this point, stating directly that the glacier's retreat has accelerated considerably over the past 40 years, a trajectory consistent with a system that crossed some meaningful threshold decades ago and has been trending in the same direction at an increasing pace ever since. In the interest of giving this story its full, honest context, rather than only the most alarming possible framing, it's genuinely important to walk through where the science has grown somewhat more reassuring in recent years alongside where it has grown more concerning, because both threads are simultaneously true and both matter to understanding where things actually stand. For a long stretch of time, one of the most catastrophic potential scenarios discussed regarding Thwaites involved something called marine ice cliff instability, a theoretical process in which, once an ice shelf's buttressing effect is removed entirely, the newly exposed vertical ice cliffs at the glacier's edge could become so tall and structurally unstable that they would begin collapsing under their own weight in a rapid runaway process, dramatically accelerating the pace at which the entire glacier disintegrates. More recent computer modeling work, published in 2024 and further examined since, has suggested that this particular worst-case mechanism may actually be less likely to occur in practice than earlier models had indicated, offering a genuine, meaningful note of relief regarding one of the most dramatic potential collapse pathways that had previously been part of the broader doomsday conversation surrounding this glacier. Doug Benn, a glaciologist who has studied the broader question of how Antarctic ice actually breaks apart and flows toward the sea, has pointed out that scientists are continuing to refine and improve these models specifically to better distinguish between genuinely catastrophic, rapid collapse scenarios and the more gradual, though still deeply consequential, ongoing retreat that the bulk of current evidence actually supports. That distinction matters enormously for how this entire situation should actually be understood, and it's worth being precise about it, rather than letting the most dramatic possible framing dominate the conversation. The disintegration of the Eastern Ice Shelf that satellite imagery has captured this year, and which researchers now expect to substantially play out within the current year, is a genuinely serious, well-documented, imminent structural event. What remains considerably less certain, and what current research has actually made somewhat less alarming than it once appeared, is exactly how quickly the loss of that shelf's buttressing effect will translate into accelerated ice loss from the grounded glacier sitting behind it, and how quickly, in turn, that accelerated ice loss will translate into measurable, global sea level rise. Some worst-case framings of Thwaites' potential collapse timeline have suggested the glacier could become largely unstable within a matter of decades, under sufficiently severe conditions. More conservative estimates, grounded in the more recent modeling work walking back the most extreme ice cliff collapse scenarios, suggest the process, while absolutely still underway and absolutely still trending in a concerning direction, is more likely to unfold gradually over a considerably longer stretch of time, closer to a century or more, rather than representing the kind of sudden, single-decade catastrophic event that the phrase Doomsday Glacier might initially suggest to someone encountering this story for the first time. None of that nuance, though, should be mistaken for genuine reassurance that this is somehow not a serious situation, and the scientists most directly involved in studying it have been consistently clear on that exact point. The nickname Doomsday Glacier sounds, to a lot of people encountering it for the first time, like a piece of media-driven exaggeration, the kind of dramatic label attached to a scientific topic purely to generate attention. Researchers who actually study Thwaites have pushed back on that assumption directly, with Robert Larder specifically stating that the nickname, however dramatic it sounds, genuinely is not an exaggeration, precisely because Thwaites functions as a structural pillar holding back a significant portion of the broader West Antarctic Ice Sheet, and losing that pillar carries consequences that extend dramatically beyond the glacier's own individual contribution to sea level rise. There's also a broader planetary scale climate signal wrapped up in this story that extends well beyond Thwaites Glacier specifically, and it's worth understanding because it helps explain why researchers describe what's happening around Antarctica right now as reflecting something more fundamental than just one particularly vulnerable glacier having a bad decade. A separate research study published in the journal Science Advances in May of this year examined what the authors describe as compound drivers of Antarctic sea ice loss and what they term Southern Ocean destratification, essentially a breakdown in the layered structure of temperature and salinity that has historically helped keep the ocean surrounding Antarctica relatively stable. That research concluded that the ocean surrounding the entire Antarctic continent has undergone what the study's authors describe as a fundamental shift, a genuine reorganization in how heat and cold water are distributed and mixed throughout that ocean system, rather than simply a modest incremental warming trend layered on top of an otherwise unchanged baseline. That kind of fundamental oceanographic shift matters enormously for understanding Thwaites specifically, because it helps explain the underlying supply of warm water increasingly capable of reaching deep beneath the glacier through those 6-mile-wide channels and swirling eddies researchers have been documenting. Thwaites isn't destabilizing in isolation. It's destabilizing within an ocean system that is itself undergoing a broader, more fundamental transformation, one that researchers are still working to fully characterize, but that clearly provides the underlying fuel making events like this year's Eastern Ice Shelf disintegration possible in the first place. There's also a broader planetary scale climate signal wrapped up in this story that extends well beyond Thwaites Glacier specifically, and it's worth understanding because it helps explain why researchers describe what's happening around Antarctica right now as reflecting something more fundamental than just one particularly vulnerable glacier having a bad decade. A separate research study published in the journal Science Advances in May of this year examined what the authors describe as compound drivers of Antarctic sea ice loss and what they term Southern Ocean destratification, essentially a breakdown in the layered structure of temperature and salinity that has historically helped keep the ocean surrounding Antarctica relatively stable. That research concluded that the ocean surrounding the entire Antarctic continent has undergone what the study's authors describe as a fundamental shift, a genuine reorganization in how heat and cold water are distributed and mixed throughout that ocean system, rather than simply a modest, incremental warming trend layered on top of an otherwise unchanged baseline. That kind of fundamental oceanographic shift matters enormously for understanding Thwaites specifically, because it helps explain the underlying supply of warm water increasingly capable of reaching deep beneath the glacier through those 6-mile-wide channels and swirling eddies researchers have been documenting. Thwaites isn't destabilizing in isolation. It's destabilizing within an ocean system that is itself undergoing a broader, more fundamental transformation, one that researchers are still working to fully characterize, but that clearly provides the underlying fuel-making events like this year's Eastern Ice Shelf disintegration possible in the first place. This broader oceanographic context also helps explain a pattern researchers have noticed across multiple glacier systems throughout West Antarctica, not just Thwaites in isolation. Thwaites' immediate neighbor, Pine Island Glacier, has been undergoing its own well-documented parallel retreat over the same multi-decade window, driven by strikingly similar underlying mechanisms involving warm ocean water intruding beneath its own ice shelves. Because Thwaites and Pine Island sit adjacent to one another along the same stretch of West Antarctic coastline, and because both glaciers ultimately drain into the same broader portion of the West Antarctic Ice Sheet, researchers studying this region increasingly treat the two systems as interconnected rather than fully independent, meaning destabilization. And one has the potential to influence and potentially accelerate destabilization in the other. That regional interconnection is part of why the scientific concerns surrounding Thwaites specifically extend so far beyond the glacier's own individual 65-centimeter sea level rise contribution. It sits within a broader neighborhood of West Antarctic ice that appears to be responding to the same underlying oceanographic shift in a broadly similar way, which is precisely the dynamic that could, under a sufficiently severe long-term trajectory, eventually connect Thwaites' retreat to a much larger scale destabilization across the wider ice sheet behind it. So what happens next, both for the glacier itself and for the broader scientific effort, trying to understand exactly where this is all heading? Researchers with the International Thwaites Glacier Collaboration have made clear that monitoring efforts are continuing essentially without pause, with satellite coverage of the Eastern Ice Shelf being checked on an almost daily basis, given how rapidly conditions have been changing this year, a level of monitoring intensity that reflects just how significant researchers consider this particular structural transition to be. Continued deployment of tools, like the Icefin underwater robot, along with additional ice-breaking research vessel missions and further GPS and satellite data collection, are expected to keep refining scientists' understanding of exactly how quickly warm water is reaching the base of the glacier, exactly how the Eastern Shelf's breakup is likely to unfold once it fully gives way, and exactly how much of an acceleration effect that breakup will ultimately have on the grounded ice sitting behind it. Every one of those questions feeds directly into the broader climate models scientists and coastal planners around the world rely on to estimate how much global sea level rise to actually expect over the coming decades. Models that carry enormous practical consequences for everything from coastal infrastructure investment decisions in cities like Miami and London to international climate adaptation planning for low-lying island nations that have comparatively little capacity to absorb the cost of getting those projections wrong. What makes this specific update genuinely significant, rather than simply another entry in a long-running story that's been generating headlines for years, is the shift in tone among the researchers themselves. For a long stretch of this glacier's ongoing study, much of the language used by scientists carried an appropriately cautious, conditional quality, describing Thwaites as vulnerable, as at risk, as a system scientists were working to better understand the potential future trajectory of. What's changed this year is that the language has shifted from conditional to declarative. Robert Larder isn't saying the Eastern Ice Shelf might eventually destabilize under the right conditions. He's saying it's definitely going to go, and that the only remaining uncertainty is precisely how the breakup will unfold, not whether it will happen at all. That shift, from probabilistic caution to direct confident statement, is itself one of the more telling signals embedded in this entire story, reflecting years of accumulated satellite observation, underwater robotic exploration, and detailed fracture analysis finally converging on a single shared conclusion among the scientists who have spent the better part of a decade specifically dedicated to understanding this one glacier's behavior. It's worth remembering, too, just how young this entire field of close, direct observational study of Thwaites actually still is. The International Thwaites Glacier Collaboration has only been directly deployed on and around the glacier since 2018, meaning researchers have had less than a decade of sustained, dedicated on the ground and under the ice observation to work with, when trying to understand a natural system that has been slowly evolving since at least the 1940s. Every new field season, every additional satellite pass, and every fresh deployment of tools like Icefin adds meaningfully to a data set that is still, in relative terms, quite young, and that youth is part of why researchers have been genuinely candid about the uncertainty still surrounding exactly how quickly the consequences of this year's ice shelf disintegration will ultimately play out. That candor shouldn't be mistaken for a lack of confidence in the underlying trend itself, which researchers describe as clear and well established. It reflects instead an honest acknowledgement that predicting the precise pace of a process this complex, playing out in one of the most remote, difficult to study environments on the entire planet, remains a genuinely difficult scientific challenge, even with nearly a decade of dedicated, purpose-built research now behind it. For people living thousands of miles away from Antarctica, in coastal cities and low-lying regions that will ultimately bear the practical consequences of however this situation continues to unfold, the most useful way to understand this story is probably not through the lens of an imminent single-event catastrophe arriving on any specific date. It's through the lens of a long-running, accelerating trend, one that has been building since a triggering event back in the 1940s, that has measurably sped up over the past 4 decades according to the collaboration's own 2025 assessment, and that has now reached the point where its last remaining natural break is actively disintegrating in front of researchers' own satellite cameras. Whether the eventual total contribution to global sea level rise plays out closer to the more modest, gradual estimates the most recent modeling work suggests, or closer to the more severe scenarios that remain part of the broader range of scientific possibility, the fundamental direction of travel here is not genuinely in dispute among the scientists who study this glacier for a living. Thwaites is retreating. The mechanism accelerating that retreat, warm water actively burrowing beneath the ice through deepening channels and swirling ocean eddies, shows every sign of continuing and potentially intensifying, rather than reversing on its own. And the last significant structural feature that had been meaningfully slowing that retreat down is, by the direct account of the researchers most closely studying it, in the process of disappearing entirely, very possibly before this year is even over. If this breakdown helped you understand what scientists are actually seeing at the bottom of the world right now and why it matters so far beyond Antarctica itself, make sure to like the video, share your own thoughts on what this means for coastal communities in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the next update as researchers continue tracking exactly how this glacier's last natural break finishes coming apart.